You have 30 days to tear down that ugly wall, or the HOA will sue you for everything you own." The room went quiet when Brandy Ashworth said it. She stood at the front of the Willowbrook Estates Community Center holding a printed violation notice like it was a trophy. Her smile was bright, but the kind that made you feel like you were already guilty of something. Around me, neighbors shifted in their folding chairs. A few people actually chuckled. Brandy slowly turned the paper so everyone could see the photos printed on it. Pictures of the flood wall I had built along the edge of my property. "There it is," she said dramatically. "Our newest eyesore." More laughter. According to her, my wall looked like something from a military bunker. A gray concrete barrier about 6 feet tall, reinforced with steel supports, running along the side of my yard. Where the creek curved behind the neighborhood, Willowbrook Estates is known for its beauty and curb appeal, Brandy continued, and we simply cannot allow structures that destroy property values. Someone in the back muttered, "Looks like a prison wall." A few people nodded. I stayed seated for a moment, letting the comments roll past me like background noise. Then I stood up. "Before everyone decides it's ugly," I said calmly, "you might want to understand why it's there." Brandy crossed her arms. "This should be good. I spent 20 years working with flood control systems." I continued. "Most of that time with the Army Corps of Engineers. And when I looked at the land here, something stood out immediately." A few people looked mildly interested, but Brandy didn't. "This neighborhood," I said, "is sitting on what used to be a natural floodplain." The room got quieter. "The creek behind our houses isn't just decorative. It has a long history of flooding. The last major overflow was about 20 years ago, and the one before that was about 20 years before that." Sit. Brandy waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please," she said. "That's ancient history. Modern engineering has solved those problems." Several neighbors nodded again. "Developers wouldn't build here if flooding was a risk." I looked around the room at the rows of expensive houses these people had poured their savings into. Then I said something that made Brandy's smile fade just a little. "They absolutely would." A few people shifted uncomfortably. "The wall I built isn't for decoration," I continued. "It's a reinforced flood barrier designed to redirect overflow water away from my house and the street." Brandy shook her head like she was tired of listening. "Well, unfortunately," she said, lifting the violation letter again, "our architectural committee disagrees." She tapped the paper with her finger. 30 days, she said. "Remove it, or we start legal action." Then she leaned closer and added quietly enough that only I could hear, "Trust me, you're not going to win a fight with this HOA." I looked at the letter in her hand, then at the neighbors who had just laughed at the one thing that might someday save their homes. And I said the one thing none of them expected. "You might want that wall a lot more than I do." 3 weeks earlier, When my wife Elena and I first drove into Willowbrook Estates, it looked like the kind of place people dream about living. Perfect sidewalks, fresh lawns, expensive SUVs parked in spotless driveways. Every house looked almost identical, like the developer had copied and pasted the same design across the entire neighborhood. Most people would see comfort. I saw warning signs. After 20 years working in flood control engineering, you develop a habit of studying land the same way a doctor studies an X-ray. Elevation, drainage paths, soil color, nearby water sources, those things jump out at you whether you want them to or not. The first thing I noticed was the creek. It curved quietly behind the houses at the edge of the neighborhood, barely wider than a small stream. It looked harmless, the kind of thing developers love to advertise as a scenic water feature. But the banks told a different story. They were too smooth, too carved out. That only happens when fast water runs through regularly. When we parked at our new house, I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the back of the property. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and old silt. Most people wouldn't recognize that smell, but I'd spent decades around rivers and flood basins. Water had been here before, and it would come back. Our lot sat on the corner, about 8 feet higher than the houses farther down the street. That elevation difference might not sound like much, but during a flood, 8 feet can mean the difference between a wet lawn and a destroyed house. "Alana," I called. She stepped out slowly, still recovering from 18 months of brutal cancer treatments. The chemo had drained her strength, and even walking across the yard made her tired some days. But she smiled when she saw the house. "It's peaceful here," she said softly. That was exactly what we wanted. After everything she had been through, we weren't looking for luxury or excitement. We just wanted quiet. A place where she could recover without constant stress. Unfortunately, stress had already moved in. While Elena went inside to rest, I grabbed a shovel and a few stacks of sandbags I'd brought with me. Nothing permanent, just temporary flood prep until I had time to study the drainage systems in the area. Within an hour, I had a simple protective barrier set up along the back edge of our property where the creek curved closest to the house. It wasn't pretty, but it was smart. I had just finished stacking the last bag when I heard the sharp click of high heels on the driveway. When I turned around, a blonde woman in expensive workout clothes was marching toward me with the confidence of someone who believed the entire neighborhood belonged to her. She carried a clipboard and a smile that already looked like trouble. "Hi there," she said brightly. "You must be the new homeowner." Then she extended her hand. Brandy Ashworth, president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA. The first real warning that something was wrong didn't come from the creek. It came from the paperwork. That night, after Brandy left my driveway with her fake smile and her community standards speech, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and the violation notice she'd handed me Alina was making tea when she asked the question every new homeowner asks sooner or later. How bad is the HOA? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened the Willowbrook Estate's financial disclosures. By law, HOAs have to make their budgets available to homeowners. Most people never bother reading them. I do. Years of engineering work had taught me that numbers almost always tell the truth, even when people don't. The first thing that jumped out at me was a line item called Daesh Flood Mitigation Management Fund for eyesores. Every homeowner in Willowbrook paid $200 a month toward it. 200 houses. $200 every month. I did the math in my head. That was nearly $500,000 a year, supposedly dedicated to flood prevention and drainage infrastructure. That kind of money should have built serious protection, reinforced drainage channels, expanded retention ponds, upgraded storm systems. Instead, when I started digging through the expense reports, something strange appeared. There were no engineering contracts, no construction permits, no drainage upgrades, nothing. Not a single dollar spent on actual flood protection. Instead, the money had been redirected into categories like landscape beautification, community aesthetics, and management consulting. I leaned back in my chair. That's interesting, I muttered. Alina sat across from me, watching my expression slowly change. Interesting good, she asked, or interesting bad? Interesting criminal, I said. She blinked. What? I turned the laptop so she could see the spreadsheet. See this fund. Everyone here pays for flood protection. She nodded. Except the protection doesn't exist. Her eyebrows lifted. Where did the money go? That, I said, scrolling through more documents, is exactly what I'm trying to figure out. Another name kept appearing over and over in the payment records. Ashworth Property Management, the company handling all HOA finances. The same last name as the woman who had just threatened to sue me over sandbags. I clicked on the company registration, and there it was. Owner Sus Daniel Ashworth, Tasakra's Brandy's husband. I stared at the screen for a long moment. So the HOA collects $500,000 a year for flood protection. Alina said slowly. Yep, and the money gets paid to the HOA president's husband. Looks that way. And there's no actual flood protection being built. Not that I can find. Alina leaned back in her chair. That seems illegal. I nodded. Oh, it definitely is. Outside the window, the creek behind the neighborhood flowed quietly through the darkness. Calm, peaceful, harmless. But suddenly, the whole situation made sense. If the neighborhood ever flooded, insurance companies would be writing massive checks, and someone connected to this HOA seemed positioned to benefit from that disaster. I closed the laptop and looked out toward the creek. Looks like our HOA president isn't just worried about curb appeal, I said quietly. Elena tilted her head. What do you mean? I tapped the violation notice Brandy had given me earlier. I think she's worried my flood wall might ruin a much bigger plan. 2. Days after I filed the permit for the flood wall, the HOA decided to make their move. And they didn't come quietly. I was outside measuring the slope near the creek when 3 SUVs rolled into my driveway like a small convoy. Doors slammed, voices murmured. Then, the familiar click of heels hit the pavement again. Brandy Ashworth stepped out first, wearing oversized sunglasses and the kind of smile people use right before delivering bad news. Behind her stood 3 other HOA board members, clutching folders and clipboards like they were about to conduct a raid. "Elena," I muttered quietly toward the house, "you might want to see this." She stepped onto the porch, leaning slightly against the railing for support. The chemo had taken a lot out of her, but the fire in her eyes was still there. Brandy walked straight toward me. "Jake," she said loudly, clearly performing for the small audience forming across the street. "We need to discuss your construction project." Construction project. You'd think I was building a missile silo. She held up a thick stack of papers. "We've gathered signatures from concerned homeowners. 47 residents believe your flood wall will negatively affect property values and neighborhood aesthetics." She handed me the petition. I flipped through the pages. Half the signatures looked suspiciously similar. Same handwriting, same pen pressure. Amateur work. How many of these people have actually seen the engineering plans? I asked calmly. "That's not the point," another board member snapped. Karen Hendris, the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian of curb appeal. "The point is community harmony. We can't have people building military structures in a residential neighborhood." Military structures. I almost laughed. Instead, I walked to my truck and pulled out the rolled blueprints for the wall. If they wanted to talk engineering, I was more than happy to educate them. I spread the drawings across the hood of the truck. "This wall isn't just for my property," I explained, pointing to the drainage channels. "It actually improves water flow for the entire street. These weep holes release pressure so water doesn't back up, and the landscaping here will make it blend into the terrain." Brandy didn't even look at the plans. She folded her arms. "Jake," she said slowly, her voice dripping with condescension, "I'm sure your military experience is very impressive." There was that tone again, the one that suggested being a veteran, somehow made me less qualified to live in a suburban neighborhood. "But this is a civilian community," she continued. "We have different standards here." For a moment, the air went quiet. Then Alina stepped forward from the porch. Her voice was calm, but it carried across the driveway like steel. "My husband spent 20 years preventing floods that could destroy entire towns," she said. "I think he can handle one creek." The silence stretched across the street. A few neighbors who had been watching from their lawns shifted uncomfortably. Brandy forced a tight smile. "Well," she said, pulling out her phone, "that may not matter anyway." She tapped the screen and turned it toward me. Photos of my temporary sandbags. I've already filed a complaint with the city about unpermitted construction," she said smugly. "An inspector will be here tomorrow." I looked at the pictures for a moment. Then I smiled. "Great," I said. Her confidence faltered slightly. "Excuse me," I said. "Great," I repeated calmly. "Inspector Rodriguez is coming tomorrow. We already spoke yesterday. Nice guy." For the first time since she arrived, Brandy Ashworth looked genuinely surprised. "You already talked to him?" "Of course," I said. Then I leaned casually against my truck. "And he's very excited to see the flood wall plans." The HOA board members looked at each other nervously, because suddenly their little intimidation campaign wasn't going the way they expected. The harassment started the next morning. At first, it was small things. The kind of things designed to make you feel like you're losing your mind. When I walked outside to grab the newspaper, I noticed something sitting in our mailbox. A dead fish. It had been shoved halfway inside, like some kind of disgusting warning. The smell hit me immediately, sharp and sour in the morning air. Alina stepped onto the porch behind me and covered her nose. "Please tell me that didn't come with the newspaper." I didn't answer right away, because I already knew what this was. This was intimidation, and it was only the beginning. Over the next week, things escalated quickly. Someone kept leaving bags of dog waste on our driveway during the night. Always before sunrise. Always when the street cameras wouldn't catch them clearly. Our newspaper disappeared 3 mornings in a row. Then Alina's flower beds, something she had carefully planted as part of her recovery therapy, were destroyed overnight. Tire tracks ran straight through them, like someone had deliberately driven across the yard. She stood there staring at the crushed plants, her hands trembling slightly. "I spent 2 weeks planting those," she whispered. "That's when I knew this wasn't just HOA politics anymore. This was a campaign. And Brandy was running it. But she was smart. She never did anything herself. Instead, she worked the neighborhood. Within days, the social temperature of Willowbrook estates completely changed. Neighbors who had waved at us before suddenly avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when we walked past. Invitations to the weekend block party somehow got lost. One evening Alina stood by the window, watching the party happening 2 houses down. Music floated through the warm air. Laughter. The smell of barbecue drifting across the yard. But we hadn't been invited. "They're turning the whole neighborhood against us," she said quietly. And then things got even uglier. A few days later, Alina came home from her oncology support group meeting looking pale with anger. "What happened?" I asked. She dropped her bag on the table. "Someone from our neighborhood showed up today." My stomach tightened. "What did they say?" Her voice shook with disbelief. "They told everyone you're unstable, that you have PTSD and violent anger issues." My fists clenched instantly. "They said I might not be safe living with you," she continued. "They suggested I stay with my sister until you get help. Do, For a moment I couldn't speak. Going after me was one thing, but attacking my wife, after everything she'd survived with cancer, that crossed every line imaginable. Who told them this? I finally asked. Elena looked at me. A blonde woman who said she lived in Willowbrook. She said slowly. I didn't even need to hear the name. Brandy. That was the moment I made a decision. Not an emotional one. A strategic one. Because, after 20 years working military, flood control operations, I had learned something very important. Anger loses battles. Information wins wars. And if Brandy Ashworth wanted to turn this into a war, then it was time for me to start digging into Willowbrook's secrets. The more I dug into Willowbrook's records, the worse everything looked. At first, I thought the missing flood protection money was just typical HOA incompetence. Maybe bad budgeting. Maybe someone had misfiled something. But after 3 nights of combing through public documents, county filings, and insurance disclosures, I realized something much darker was happening. This wasn't incompetence. This was a system. And it was designed to make money when the neighborhood flooded. The first clue appeared in the insurance policies. Every homeowner in Willowbrook had been encouraged, almost pressured, to buy flood protection coverage through the same company, Cromwell Insurance. On the surface, the policies looked legitimate, but buried deep in the fine print was a clause that made my stomach tighten. Existing flood conditions not covered. To the average homeowner, that line meant nothing. To someone who had spent decades in flood management, it meant everything. It meant the insurance company could legally deny claims if they argued the land had a known flood history. And Willowbrook absolutely did, which meant hundreds of families were paying for protection they might never receive. But the real shock came when I discovered who worked for Cromwell Insurance. Brandy's husband. I stared at the document for a long time. Same last name, same address, regional policy supervisor. That alone would have been suspicious. But then I looked deeper. Every policy in Willowbrook had been signed by the same local agent, an office that had opened just 6 months before the development finished construction. Right around the same time the HOA began collecting flood mitigation fees. $200 per home. 200 homes, almost $500,000 every year. And none of it had gone toward flood protection. Not a single drainage upgrade, not one retention basin improvement. Just landscaping projects, decorative fountains, and administrative costs. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my temples. If this place flooded, the insurance company could deny the claims. And the HOA had never actually built the flood systems they promised. That meant homeowners would lose everything, and someone else would walk away rich. I needed confirmation, so I called an old friend, Doug Martinez. We had served together years ago before he moved into county utilities engineering. 2 days later, Doug pulled into my driveway under the excuse of visiting an old army buddy. We walked the neighborhood together. He didn't even need an hour. By the time we reached the creek behind the houses, he was shaking his head. "Jakey, this drainage system is a disaster." "How bad?" I asked. Doug pointed toward the storm drains along the street. "They're half the size they should be. The retention ponds are placed in the wrong locations. And the creek channeling," he let out a low whistle. "It's practically funneling water straight toward the houses." In a big storm, Doug looked directly at me. "In a real flood, this neighborhood turns into a bowl." He paused. "And everyone inside it becomes the fish." The storm arrived faster than anyone expected. For 2 days, the weather reports had mentioned heavy rain in the mountains, but nobody in Willowbrook seemed concerned. People still walked their dogs. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalks. Lawn sprinklers still ran like water was unlimited. But I knew what mountain rain meant. Mountain rain meant runoff. And runoff always follows gravity. By late afternoon, the sky turned a deep gray that swallowed the sun. The wind picked up just enough to rattle loose construction signs down the street. From my backyard, I could hear the creek behind the houses beginning to roar instead of trickle. That sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Water was coming. Fast. I walked inside where Alina was watching the dark clouds through the window. "It's starting," I said quietly. She looked toward the backyard where the concrete flood wall stood, thick, reinforced, ugly according to the HOA. But strong enough to stop a truck. Rain began falling an hour later. Not gentle rain. The kind that sounds like gravel hitting the roof. Within 30 minutes, the storm drains on our street were already overwhelmed. Water started flowing down the pavement like a shallow river. I watched it gather speed as it moved downhill, straight toward the lowest houses in the neighborhood. Exactly the way I had predicted. Then the creek broke its banks. Mud-colored water exploded over the edge and poured across the backyards like a wave. Fences disappeared first. Then patio furniture started floating past like toys. From my second floor window, I saw something chilling. The water wasn't spreading evenly. It was funneling. Doug had been right. The bad drainage design was directing everything toward the center of the neighborhood. Houses down the street started flooding within minutes. Car alarms began screaming. People ran outside shouting, trying to move vehicles that were already half underwater. And then someone started banging on my front door. Hard. When I opened it, Brandy stood there. But the confident HOA president I remembered was gone. Her makeup had streaked down her face from the rain. Mud covered her expensive shoes. Behind her, water rushed down the street like a brown river. "Please," she gasped. "Our house is flooding. The whole street is underwater." Her voice cracked. "You were right about the flood." I stepped aside and looked past her. Cars were already floating. Water was pouring into the first floors of the homes that had laughed at my wall just weeks earlier. Behind my house, the floodwater slammed into the concrete barrier and stopped. Not a single drop crossed onto my property. Brandy stared at the wall like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Then she whispered the words she never thought she'd say. "Please, can we come inside?"